As John mentioned, I'm the Land Stewardship Manager for Galveston Bay Foundation, and I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about private land conservation and the efforts we put forward towards that at Galveston Bay Foundation, and specifically conservation easements, and that's one of the tools we use to achieve land conservation within our watershed here. And my role at the foundation is to not only acquire lands for conservation purposes, but also manage them for wildlife habitats and water quality and various plant communities. So a little bit of a acquisition and management is my role. A little bit about Galveston Bay Foundation. Our mission is to preserve, protect, and enhance the natural resources of the Galveston Bay estuary. And we do that through 4 main programs: Advocacy, where we seek solutions with the diverse users, industrial, commercial, and recreational users of the bay. Conservation, which is the group that I work under, we implement projects to preserve and enhance or restore or create natural resources in the bay. Education, educating school-age children or adults on the values of our bay, where it is and why it's good. And then we support research for all our partnerships and partners trying to promote good science within the bay system. We are an accredited land trust. We are one of 9 accredited land trusts in the state of Texas. There are about 35 land trusts that operate throughout the state, and 9 are accredited. This means we've been through a rigorous evaluation of how we operate and what policies and procedures we conduct when we are acquiring land, whether that's in fee simple purchases or conservation easements, and how we operate financially as an organization as well. So what this does is it promotes consistency throughout the land conservation community, making sure that all these organizations are doing work similarly and helping to promote permanence of our conservation work and hopefully increase the pace of our conservation work. And I really encourage you to look for the seal. This is our accredited seal if anybody is interested in doing conservation work as a starting point. Not saying that all accredited land trusts are the right fit for your conservation projects, and not saying that conservation organizations that aren't accredited do not do good work, but it's a good starting point for you to look up when you're starting to explore your options for land conservation. A little bit about Galveston Bay. We are the largest bay in Texas, the 7th largest in the nation, and the 2nd most productive bay in the U.S. We follow behind Chesapeake Bay, which is a much larger area. We're fed by 2 main sources of fresh water, the San Jacinto River and the Trinity River. And it's important to note that nearly half of Texans in the state, people in the state, live within the Galveston Bay watershed, because we have encompass the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex area all the way down to the Houston area. So a lot of people, a lot of stress on our water resources in the Galveston Bay system. This is where we work, kind of our geographical boundary here. This is kind of washed out in this screen, but this is Houston, and this is down in Lake Jackson over to High Island and Anahuac and Liberty. And most of our projects here, you kind of see these dots on the map, are where we have done work, done conservation projects, land conservation projects. And that's both in fee simple purchases, where we actually own the land. We own about 3,300 acres of land, and we have about 2,600 acres of land where we hold conservation easements, which is we are another party, another interest on the deed to a private landowner who actually maintains that property. And so since 1991, when we acquired our first tract of land, I think it was a small tract, 12 acres over in the Oak Island community in Chambers County along Trinity Bay, and one of these 2 dots here. We've amassed almost 6,000 acres of properties for conservation, and they've all to date been associated with some water body or tributary of Galveston Bay. And we've done this a variety of ways. We've accepted donations of fee simple and conservation easement lands. We've worked with regulatory agencies to work with mitigation projects, the resulting of core permits, mitigation banks. We've purchased properties and easements outright, and we've done our first bargain sale last year, I think, where we actually did a combination of a donation and a purchase at the same time, where we purchased a portion and the remainder of that value was donated as a charitable contribution. So kind of just the area of where we work as an organization. I wanted to start with the need for private land conservation. Why do we need to work with landowners to protect our natural resources in Texas? And a Texas A&M study stated that in Texas, 83% of our lands can be categorized as a privately owned farm, ranch, or forest. And that same study stated that over 1 million acres of those farms, ranches, and forests that were privately held were converted in 15 years from 97 to 2012. So a pretty alarming rate. And you can kind of see here on this map where the highest rate of land conversion is located. And not surprisingly, in the most heavily populated areas throughout the state, the San Antonio, Austin corridor, Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, the Valley, and El Paso, where we're seeing rapid rates of land conversion and pretty alarming. So what does this mean for our resources? Land fragmentation does impact us. It impacts our water quality and water quantity. It impacts the habitats that support wildlife and plant communities. And it impacts our sustainability for agricultural practices. So making these parcels of land smaller and smaller and smaller definitely has a major impact on how we're going to be able to operate in the future as in our rural areas. One reason that's really important, why it's really important to work with private landowners on conservation efforts, is that it's incredibly expensive for governments or conservation organizations to manage properties appropriately for conservation purposes. So taking on these properties onto Galveston Bay Foundation or Katy Prairie Conservancy or Almond Bayou, I mean, these properties take a lot of resources to manage appropriately. So by leaving land in private ownership, puts that burden back on the private landowner, who then will explore some of these markets that Jim just talked about, hopefully, and be able to continue to manage as they have for years or decades or generations even. It also keeps property in rural areas on their local tax rolls, helps support their local governments and infrastructure and school districts. And we know that population growth and urban sprawl are going to continue to consume our natural areas as it's likely inevitable that our population is going to continue to grow. We can work with private landowners to help target where conservation efforts are made and hopefully make progress in protecting some of our most ecologically sensitive areas. So getting into one of the tools we use for conservation is a conservation easement. And landowners are somewhat scared of this term. They usually, it usually has a negative connotation in a rural community, a conservation easement. People think that they're going to come take our land. This is a bad thing. But what if we approached it as something that was maybe a definition that was a little different, a voluntary agreement between a landowner and a land trust to protect natural resources? That doesn't sound as threatening. And that's basically what it is. It's a legal agreement that will restrict the future land uses on the property. And it's aimed at protecting natural resources, environmental qualities on a piece of property, and that we collectively call those the conservation values. That's what we're protecting with this document. And a qualified easement holder must be the recipient of the conservation easement. There's actually a requirement that organizations have to meet in order to hold easements. And they can be a public agency, federal government, local governments can hold easements. And then like Galveston Bay Foundation, we are a private nonprofit organization, a 501c3, and we consider ourselves a land trust. And so I will use that term throughout this presentation, that we are a land trust. We are charitably going out and protecting land for conservation purposes. So here's the basics. We're going to start with the concept that real property is a bundle of rights that you have, and there's various rights within owning the deed of a property. And those rights can be split apart from each other and owned by one or more people at any given time. And the easiest way that I can explain that resonates with Texas landowners or Texans is mineral rights. Many of the mineral rights in Texas have been severed from the surface estate, sometimes decades or generations ago, and there are two different controlling interests. One person owns the surface, they run cattle and they farm, and then another entity, person or corporation owns the mineral rights, and they work together as co-owners of that estate. Well, development rights can be treated the same way. You can strip those development rights away from the surface estate of the property and sell those at a value. And we'll talk about how they are valued in a minute. But they can be donated as a charitable gift. The development rights of the property can be donated or sold at a fair market value price, or a combination of the two in what's called the bargain sale. And this is my personal opinion, is that conservation easements should be perpetual. Some entities do allow term easements, but we only operate with perpetual easements. Long-term, perpetual is a long time. How long is forever? That's a difficult question to ask or to answer. And but we are preparing to steward these properties in perpetuity when we acquire them. The language and terms of a conservation easement are flexible. It can be tailored to each individual property owner and each individual property, determined on what conservation values you are going to be protecting on the property. And you can negotiate that at the table with the landowner. So each easement is unique to the property that it's protecting. And conservation easements are good negative covenants. And what that means is they are restrictive documents. They're good at telling you what we cannot do on this property. They're not good at telling you what you can do on this property. So in general, they're a negative, a restrictive document that tells a landowner that you cannot do this, this, and this. Sometimes it doesn't sound great when you're explaining this to somebody at the table, when you're in their living room saying, well, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do that. But that's the way the document is intended to function, as a negative covenant. And the land trust's role in this whole deal is to enforce the terms of that easement. So when you negotiate all these terms, someone has to enforce the terms of those of that contract in perpetuity. So the way we do that is when we initiate when we establish a conservation easement, we create a document called the baseline inventory, and that is a report that details the ecological functions, the conservation values, and the general terms of the easement in one easy-to-read document. And it also is associated with a photographic log that will show pictures of the highlights of the property, the important ecological features that we're protecting. And then annually, we will take a monitoring visit out to the site. At least once per year, we're required to go out to the site and visit, meet with the landowner, talk about how things are going, physically inspect the property, and that's how we would enforce our requirement, the terms of these easements. So we would notice at that point if something had been, one of those covenants had been broken. So what does a conservation easement restrict? What can we restrict with a conservation easement? The two main things that we restrict in a conservation easement in this area is subdivision of the property. We want to keep these tracts in their original or their current size and shape. And then development of structures, reducing or restricting altogether the number of structures that can be created on this property. We may work with the landowner to say, you can build a house, you can build a barn, but we're going to identify where those are in the conservation easement and put it on a map and say, this is where you can build your house, but we're going to protect the rest of this. We'll address roads and fences, other infrastructure, management of natural areas, care for historical features, timber, hunting, fishing, agricultural uses. If we're going to farm or ranch, how are you going to farm it? How are you going to ranch this property? What's appropriate for the ecological sustainability of this tract of land? And two that are in red here are always big sticking points. Public access. Sometimes landowners have misinformation that a conservation easement is going to provide an avenue for the general public to access their property. And that's not true at all. A landowner may wish to allow that. They may wish to say, we will allow public access on our property, but in no way does this document allow or force a landowner to accept the public onto their property. And the other one is, especially a hot topic in this area, is the production and exploration of subsurface minerals. Let me back up. we will automatically and permanently restrict any extraction of minerals from the property from a surface mining method. That includes coal and lignite, gravel, sand, caliche, those types of things. No surface mining will be allowed on a property that has a conservation easement. That's a given. But subsurface, those mineral estates we talked about that may be severed, can we restrict the production of oil and gas on properties in Texas? And the answer is yes or no or maybe. I mean, it's very, very complex. You need about 3 attorneys to tell you depending on what situation. The way we address it is that most of the mineral rights have been severed from the surface estate, and those mineral right holders will be we will have to be subordinate to their rights to extract those minerals. However, we will certainly work with those mineral right holders to establish what's called a surface use agreement. Try to help dictate where they're going to drill and where they're going to place their production, their infrastructure, and try to work with them to minimize their impacts on our properties. And hopefully, when they're done with their production, we will work with them to remediate the site to minimize the impacts and long-term damages. So why would a landowner consider a conservation easement? What would make this seem like a good idea to them? One, you have to have some basis, at the root of this decision has to be some level of desire to protect your land, whether that's because it's been in your family for a long time and you want to pass this to the next generation, whether it's because you've worked really hard to make it what it is and you want to see that condition of the property passed down to the next landowner, whether it's family or they're going to sell it to somebody else, imposing the way that you have managed your land onto the next landowner, or to perpetuate a cultural heritage. In some of these smaller rural areas, farming and ranching is becoming increasingly hard to do. So providing these areas for those types of functions is one reason. There's also a financial benefit, financial aspect to making this decision, and that can be realized in several ways. One is through income tax benefits. Landowners may be able to deduct the value of their donated easement from their federal income tax. And estate planning, you can help avoid federal estate taxes. And then if you choose to sell an easement, you can actually access a value of your property in the short term without selling a piece of your property off. Qualifying for an income tax deduction is, the IRS makes it a little difficult, but here are the minimum requirements you have to meet. It must be perpetual. It must be held by a qualified conservation organization, and it must meet at least one of these conservation purposes to benefit the general public. And that's either outdoor recreation and education, protection of a relatively natural habitat, preservation of open space, or historically important land or certified structure. And because of some pretty egregious tax fraud that went on in the 90s and 2000s, we have to go through a pretty diligent appraisal process to justify, substantiate these tax donations. So making sure that your appraisal is up to snuff is pretty important when you're working with a landowner trying to qualify for a federal tax deduction. So now that we know that these can be valuable for landowners, how do we value the easement? How are we going to get a value? How do you place a dollar figure on these easements? And the method we use for an appraisal is before and after. Before the appraisal versus after the appraisal. What's the difference in the price? And I'll get 2 examples here of how how there could be a difference in the valuation of 1,000 acres, basically. So Uncle Joe, his ranch is 1,000 acres. It's in Matagorda County. We have estimated value in land of $3,000 per acre or $3 million. He goes through, works with the land trust, establishes a conservation easement. The appraiser comes in after the easement and says, now your property is worth 1,800 acres, $1,800,000. So his conservation easement is worth $1.2 million, or 40% of the fair market value. Aunt Mary's farm is in Harris County on the Katy Prairie, and she has a lot higher development potential. She has the new strip center coming in, or the new school, and they have appraised her value at $10 million, or $10,000 per acre. And she says, I don't want to develop my property. I'm going to work with a land trust and protect the conservation values on this piece of property. It's been in my family for a long time. They appraised her property after the easement at $4 million. So she has decreased her value $6 million, or 60% of her original fair market value. So there's what you are restricting on your property, which is the development potential, is how you evaluate, how you put a valuation on these conservation easements. And a rule of thumb, we can typically use a very rural area. The conservation easement value may be worth about 1/3 of the fair market value. And in an urban area, it might be worth about 2/3 of the fair market value. It's kind of just a generic rule of thumb, or a lot of people will use 50%, kind of go down the middle and say, we can get you roughly 50% of your fair market value for a conservation easement. So how do you put these values, how do you put money back in your pocket? As I mentioned earlier, a conservation easement, it will be considered a charitable contribution to a qualified organization, and it is treated currently as a standard non-cash charitable contribution, which allows you to take a 30% deduction, or 30% of your adjusted gross income, and if you can't take all of your deduction in the first year, then you can carry it over for 5 consecutive years until you use your deduction up or you run out of time. So in this situation, I'm going to make an assumption that most individuals that would benefit from a income tax deduction are of means. They have a high income or higher income. So we're going to assume that this easement donor has an adjusted gross income of $450,000. Now this puts him in a 35% tax bracket. He makes a donation of a conservation easement. It's valued at $3 million. Based on his 30% limitation on his annual deduction, he can deduct $135,000 each year based on this donation of conservation easement. His annual tax savings as a result of that $135,000 deduction is $47,000. He can carry this forward for 6 years, so 6 times $47,000 is a little over $280,000. That's a good it's a good chunk of change, but it's not a great carrot to dangle out in front of a landowner and says, you're giving us $3 million, here's $280,000 back. Go ahead.
I have a friend who's into mitigation banking in Virginia, and I was getting ready for this seminar talking to him. He told me there was legislation that was passed under the W. Bush administration that extended that amortization period.
Right, that's the next slide here, so we're going to get there. There's currently legislation. It's got a lot of bipartisan support and it's been enacted in the past. It just expired at January 1st, 2015. But what happened is these enhanced tax incentives were set for a term, and once they expired, it reverted back to that same scenario where we have 30% for 5 years. The enhanced conservation tax deduction allows a landowner to take 50% of their adjusted gross income each year and carry it forward for 15 years. And farmers and ranchers that have over 50% of their annual income from agricultural purposes can deduct 100% of their adjusted gross income. So that same scenario where we have the easement donor that makes $450,000 a year, 35% tax bracket, and $3 million valuation on his contribution, can now deduct $225,000 per year, giving him an annual tax savings of $78,000. And he will need 14 years to carry forward his total over $1 million of actual cash savings. This is cash in his pocket that he's not paying to the federal government for income tax. So he will be able to use his entire tax deduction over the course of the first year plus 13 additional years of taking his $225,000 deduction annually. So that's how it could benefit. This is an incredibly important piece of legislation for conservation organizations. It will help increase the pace of conservation in the United States. Let's see here. The other way you can take value out of your property is by purchasing or selling an easement. And then I want to give you one example of how we have purchased an easement in this area. This is in a farm in Brazoria County. The family had undivided interest. One family was the farming entity. They possessed the property. They used the property for farming rice, raising cattle, and recreating. And they were approached by about 40% undivided interest on the other side of the family, who had organized and said, we want out of the property. We want to remove our value from the property, and we won't bother you again. So they were forced with partitioning their property in half, dividing it, selling off a piece of the property, 500 acres or so, to pay for that buyout of the other undivided interest. Well, they didn't necessarily want to do that. They wanted to keep their property that they've been working for a long time in the same condition that it is, the same boundaries. So we worked with them to establish a conservation easement. We negotiated the terms of the easement. We went and got funding through the Texas Farm and Ranch Lands Conservation Program and protected 1,100 acres. They were able to use the money to buy out the other undivided interests on the property and maintain their family operation as a farming and ranching family in the Brazoria County area. And it has about 110 acres of bottomland hardwood forest along Austin Bayou, which is a tributary to West Galveston Bay, and significant wildlife and water quality values for rice farming in the area. So a good success project for us, but able to generate a significant amount of money for the family, over $1.3 million they received for this easement. So it's, and they were able to continue to farm and ranch as they had been doing. It just limits their potential to develop in the future, which they didn't really have an interest in the first place. So quick summary, Texas needs to increase our private land conservation efforts. We need private land conservation in Texas. The federal government, the state government, and conservation organizations can't own enough land at the scale we need to be successful in our efforts to sustain our ecological systems. Conservation easements provide perpetual protection for privately owned lands in cooperation with the land trust. The restrictions are tailored to meet the needs of each individual property owner, and they can provide significant economic benefits for landowners. So one shameless plug for GBF events. We have you've missed a few of these already, but we have a Bay Day coming up. This is the Kima Boardwalk. It's a family-friendly activity. A fishing tournament, our second or third annual fishing tournament in Bolivar Peninsula. It's for ladies. Our luncheon in September at the Hilton Americas of Houston, and our Bike Around the Bay for any of you cyclists out there coming up in October. So that said, I think I'm over time already. Any questions?